visas enabled 30,000 people to live, 12,000 of them Jews, and my father among them. My father's story begins in Antwerp, Belgium. Antwerp is a city in the northern part of Belgium, near the border with Holland. It's in the Flemish part of the country. In May of 1940, my father was 22 years old. He was working in the family business. They were diamond dealers. They buy and sell diamonds. They were importers and exporters of diamonds. On May 10th, 1940, the Germans invaded Antwerp, they invaded Belgium, as well as Holland and Luxembourg and France on that day. This was 8 months after Germany invaded Poland. So my father and his family knew what was ahead. I don't have the exact date, but in speaking to my siblings, I've learned that right around May 10th, right around the invasion, the occupation of Belgium, my grandfather realized that really time had run out. There was no more time to spend in Europe, that they really had to leave. And if it wasn't that very day, it was the very next day they departed. They didn't have time to make preparations. They couldn't sell their house. They couldn't pack. There were German soldiers everywhere. There were bullets flying. And there were also Nazi collaborators, so they did not want to be seen leaving. The train stations, the rail stations were manned by German soldiers who were rounding up people. So they had to get out into their own power. They couldn't use public transportation. What they did was they just walked away. They pretended they were going out for a stroll. They left with the clothes on their backs and some money and diamonds in their pockets, and that proved to be instrumental in their survival. They didn't have time to really make any other preparations, so they left behind their house, all their possessions, and their business, and they walked away. On the outskirts of Antwerp, they were able to acquire a car using the money or diamonds that they were carrying, and this was their transportation. The master plan was to travel through 4 countries, Belgium, France, Spain, and Portugal, and that would be a voyage of about 800 miles. Get from Antwerp to Lisbon, reach the port of Lisbon, leave their car, get on a boat, and sail to America. That was their plan. The trip from Antwerp, Belgium, in around May 10th of 1940 till June 20th, 1940, proved to be a difficult, perilous, gut-wrenching trip. Traveling that distance in occupied Belgium and France was very different than traveling from Albany to Buffalo on I-90. There was danger at every turn. My father didn't share a lot of that part of his life. I did learn, though, that there were advancing troops on the grounds, and the Luftwaffe was strafing the countryside, and they were trying to dodge all the Nazi collaborators as well as the Nazis themselves. They, at one point, the story that I heard was somewhere along traveling in France, there was the traffic was just backed up. The cars weren't moving. People were walking along the roads, people in cars, and it was barely moving. When the Luftwaffe was strafing the cars that were parked, at which point my father and his family jumped out of the car and ran for cover. They dove into a ditch, as did other people. And my father said that they were just as worried for the well-being of their vehicle as they were for their lives, because if the car took on bullets and was non-functional, they would have been stranded. They wouldn't have been able to move along. I don't know how they survived those 5 or 6 weeks from Antwerp to Bayonne, France, where they ended up getting their visa. I don't know how they got food or fuel, where they slept. I don't know any aspect of that. But I imagine it was very, very difficult. But I do know that my father and his family reached Bayonne on June 20th, because I have my father's passport. I made a copy of it, and it is stamped by Vice Consul Braga, who was operating under the direct orders of Aristide de Sousa Mendes, and he stamped my father's passport. Salazar, at that point, was very upset with Sousa Mendes for ignoring the edict known as Circular 14, and he notified the Spanish Border Patrol at that point and told them, don't honor visas issued by the Portuguese. So even though my father had this visa, at that point, it was very hard to cross the border. Looking at his passport, I found another stamp, and it says here that he entered Spain on June 22nd. So my guess is that he tried on the 20th, he and his family tried to cross the border on the 20th, on the 21st, on the 22nd, and probably went to a remote mountain crossing where they had not yet gotten word about ignoring these visas from the Portuguese. And he made it across. And had he not, he would not have survived, because on June 22nd, 1940, that was the day of the Franco-German armistice. Hitler was in Paris on that day. On the very next day, on June 23rd, Bayonne was occupied by the Germans. So my father got out the day before the Nazis came into Bayonne. It was that close. I remember my father telling me at one point, although he did not talk much about it, he said the words, "I was just one step ahead of the Nazis." And I realize now that that was not an exaggeration. It could have come down to hours. He crossed on the 22nd, and the Nazis were in Bayonne, rounding people up on the 23rd. Also on the 23rd, the whole visa stamping operation run by Sousa Mendes was completely shut down. He was recalled to Lisbon on that day. So it was a very close call. Onward he went. They were on the other side of the border, and they still had a very perilous, difficult trip until they reached Lisbon. At that point, it was September, and I have other papers and documentation showing that he sailed out of the port of Lisbon on September 18th and came to America. That is not the end of the story. My father came to America. He was a new immigrant, and as his family was settling in, my grandfather and my father's brother and his uncle were starting up their diamond business in New York. I wanted my father to do that, but my father wanted to join the Army. So he presented himself to the armed forces, and he said, "Take me." And they turned him down. They said, you're not even a citizen, and we can't draft you, and this is peacetime. In 1940, while there was all kinds of chaos and mayhem going on in Europe, it was peacetime in America. It was only after Pearl Harbor in December of '41 that we went to war, and in early 1942, my father tried again. He went to the armed forces, and went to the Army, and he said, "I'd like to volunteer." And this time, Uncle Sam said, "Welcome aboard, we're happy to have you." So he joined the Army, went to basic training, and from there he applied to and got accepted into officer candidate school. And while he was there, finishing up as in OCS, the Army realized that they had an amazing asset with my father, because he spoke 8 languages fluently, and they felt that they could use this talent when they're fighting a war in Europe. So, although my father was training at the time to be an artillery officer, the Army said, lots of people can do that, but we don't have too many fellows here who can speak 8 languages. So they sent him off for more training to become an intelligence officer, which he did. And that's what he did during the Army. And when, after D-Day and Americans were on Belgian soil, he was deployed overseas, and he was sent to his hometown of Antwerp, Belgium. So everything had come full circle. Of all places, he was in Antwerp, Belgium. My father's job for the Army was to interrogate suspected Nazi collaborators. And from what he told me, unfortunately, there were quite a few Nazi collaborators in northern Belgium. And that's what he did for Uncle Sam during the war. War ended, came back as captain. He went back to his civilian life, worked as a diamond dealer, until 1948, when Israel was born. And that's when my father decided to move to Israel. And he moved his diamond business over there in Tel Aviv. Actually, he had 2 offices, both in New York and in Tel Aviv. It was in those early years in 1950, 48, 49, 50, that he met my mother. They got married. My brother was born in Tel Aviv. Eventually, they came back to America, had 4 more children. And in the early 50s, my father decided he no longer wanted to be a diamond dealer. And he had this GI Bill. And he said, you know, I never got a chance to go to college. This is something that I want to do. And I had to hand it to my mother. 5 kids. Her husband says, I want to go to college now. And she said, go for it. And he did. And my father went to Columbia University. He got in 4 years, he got 3 college degrees. He got his bachelor's, master's, and PhD in 4 years. It took me 4 years to get my bachelor's degree. But my father got his doctorate in 17th century French literature. So all the years that I knew my father, he was an academic. He was a college professor, and he was a writer. Sadly, he passed away in 1975 at the age of 57. But he had 35 more years, thanks to Aristide de Sousa Mendes. And I'm here able to tell his story because of that brave man. And there are 30,000 other stories. And as Harry said earlier, that multiplies through the generations. I'm here with my son, and I have a daughter who's off in college. And there are people who are descendants who have grandchildren and nieces and nephews, and we're all here because of Sousa Mendes. It's important to remember him and honor his memory. I tried to do that last month. I was in Israel. I visited Yad Vashem, and in Yad Vashem there is a very nice memorial to him, as well as a plaque in the garden for the righteous Gentiles. And I took a picture. I even got myself in the shadow there. And it says, there are a lot of plaques for any Gentiles, all the Gentiles who saved Jews during the Holocaust. And they're grateful. And it says here, both in Hebrew and in English, Aristide de Sousa Mendes and the country. This is Portugal. So that's the story of my family. And I feel very grateful that I can relate that to you.